August 6, 1942. The aircraft carrier Shikaku lay at anchor in Truk Lagoon, motionless under the humid Pacific air. Its flight deck was deserted, the hangar below silent. No engines, no orders, no movement. Deep beneath the deck, in a smoke-filled conference room, 5 senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy sat around a long table. Spread before them were maps, casualty reports, and the latest intelligence summaries. They had been meeting for over 3 hours. For the last 10 minutes, not a single word had been spoken. Finally, Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi broke the silence. His voice was calm, steady, but heavy with the truth none of them wished to say aloud. "Gentlemen, we must face what these numbers are telling us. The war is lost." No one responded, no one argued. They didn't have to. Every man in that room already knew. That day, August 6, 1942, marked exactly 2 months since the Battle of Midway, and the implications of that battle were finally undeniable. Japan had lost the momentum of the war, perhaps forever. The terrible irony was that the very strike meant to destroy American naval power, Pearl Harbor, had instead sealed Japan's defeat. To understand how these admirals reached such a devastating conclusion, we must return to where it all began, December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, the perfect attack. That morning, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carefully orchestrated plan unfolded with near-perfect precision. Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor with overwhelming force, sinking or damaging 8 American battleships, destroying 188 aircraft, and killing 403 servicemen. It was a tactical masterpiece. Almost. Because even as smoke rose from the harbor, the critical failures were already clear to those paying attention. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. They were at sea, untouched. The fuel storage tanks holding millions of gallons of vital oil were left unharmed. The submarine base was ignored, and the repair yards that could bring ships back into service remained completely intact. Yamamoto himself is said to have remarked afterward, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Historians still debate whether he truly said those exact words. But by early 1942, Japanese intelligence already confirmed what he had feared. Their analysts estimated Japan had just 6 to 8 months before American industry would begin producing ships, planes, and weapons on a scale that Japan could never match. 8 months. By August 1942, that window had slammed shut. The turning point had already come, at Midway. Midway, the catastrophic turning point. In early June 1942, Japan's Navy suffered its most devastating defeat. 4 of its main fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed. These weren't just ships. They were the core of Japan's naval power, and the elite crews that manned them were irreplaceable. Japan had entered the war with 10 fleet carriers. By August, only 6 remained, 2 of them badly damaged. Meanwhile, American shipyards were building new carriers at a pace that stunned Japanese planners. Over a dozen massive Essex-class carriers, larger, faster, and more capable, were already under construction. The first would be ready by early 1943. By 1944, the United States would hold such overwhelming superiority that Japan's entire defensive strategy would collapse. But the carrier imbalance was only the beginning. Intelligence reports showed an even more terrifying statistic: aircraft production. In 1941, American factories produced 19,000 military aircraft. Japan built roughly 5,000. But America's numbers were climbing exponentially. By 1943, the United States was expected to produce 85,000 aircraft a year, while Japan might manage 16,000, and only if everything went perfectly. The pilot crisis. Among those at the August meeting was Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Still recovering from wounds sustained at Midway, he had come to present a grim report. Japan had begun the war with around 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots, men who had spent years perfecting their craft, arguably the best naval aviators in the world. By August 1942, nearly 40% of them were dead, lost at the Coral Sea, Midway, and in the brutal air battles over the Solomon Islands. Those who survived were exhausted, flying multiple sorties a day with almost no rest. The new pilots coming through training were nowhere near ready. They averaged barely 200 flight hours compared to the veterans' 800 or more. Meanwhile, the United States was training thousands of pilots every month. Their training might not have been as intense, but their sheer numbers ensured that every loss could be replaced. Japan's couldn't. Fuchida's analysis was bleak. At the current rate of losses, Japan would run out of experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, regardless of how many ships remained. And that wasn't the only front collapsing. While the air war worsened, the reports from beneath the sea painted an equally grim picture. Japan's submarine fleet, though technically advanced, had achieved little. They were used mostly for fleet support, not to hunt the merchant ships that kept America's industry running. The United States, on the other hand, had chosen a very different strategy. American submarines had begun targeting Japan's merchant convoys, severing the arteries of its empire one ship at a time. Japan's economy relied almost entirely on imports: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from the Philippines and China. All of it had to cross waters that were now prowled by American subs. Admiral Yamaguchi presented the shipping loss reports. In January 1942, Japan lost 15 merchant vessels. By June, that number had doubled to 30. In August, it climbed to 40. The pattern was unmistakable and terrifying. At this pace, Japan would lose so much shipping by 1944 that it wouldn't even be able to sustain its civilian economy, let alone a global war. Their shipyards couldn't keep up. They could replace maybe 200,000 tons of merchant shipping per year, but were losing 300,000 tons annually and rising. The numbers spoke for themselves. Japan was bleeding to death through its own sea lanes. Japan's early triumphs had come fast and spread wide. In just 6 months, they had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and dozens of islands across the Pacific. But success had created its own disaster. The empire's new defensive perimeter stretched thousands of miles, an enormous expanse to protect with limited men, ships, and fuel. Each garrison was isolated, each supply line fragile. The Americans, by contrast, could choose where and when to strike. They could concentrate their strength, while Japan had to defend everywhere at once. It was an impossible equation. Even if both sides had equal power, the U.S. held the advantage. But they didn't. American strength was growing with every passing week. Japan's was shrinking. Mathematically, strategically, and logistically. The outcome was already determined. No room for peace. One admiral cautiously suggested an alternative. Perhaps Japan could seek a negotiated settlement. Offer to withdraw from some territories in exchange for peace. The suggestion drew bitter laughter. They had all read the intelligence summaries on American public opinion. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. wasn't interested in compromise. The attack had united Americans in a way Japan's leaders had never imagined. What was meant to crush American morale had instead forged it into steel. Factories were running day and night. War bonds were oversold. Women were filling factories in record numbers. There would be no ceasefire, no negotiated peace. America now demanded unconditional surrender, nothing less. What went wrong? As the meeting continued, the officers turned to a painful question. Where had they gone wrong? The attack on Pearl Harbor had achieved every tactical goal, yet strategically it had doomed them. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, offered his view. The plan, he explained, had been designed to cripple America's battleship fleet. buying Japan 6 months to secure its new empire. The assumption was that repeated defeats would break American will, forcing the U.S. to negotiate. But this belief had been fatally flawed. First, battleships were no longer the decisive weapon. By missing the American carriers, Japan had left its most dangerous enemy untouched. Second, Japan had completely misread the American psyche. Instead of fear and hesitation, the attack brought unity and fury. Third, Pearl Harbor handed the United States moral authority on the global stage. The victim of a sneak attack could now call on allies and resources worldwide. And finally, the timing of the attack itself had branded Japan a nation of treachery. Their diplomats were supposed to deliver a formal declaration of war half an hour before the bombs fell, but delays in decoding caused it to arrive after the attack began. The result was devastating. Pearl Harbor was seen not as a bold strike, but as an act of deceit. President Roosevelt called it a day of infamy, and that phrase would haunt Japan for the rest of the war. The Doolittle Shock. Admiral Yamaguchi produced another report, the Doolittle Raid of April 1942. 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet, had struck Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. The physical damage was minor, a few buildings destroyed, a handful of casualties. But the psychological impact was immense. The raid shattered the illusion that Japan's home islands were safe. It forced Japan to divert fighters and anti-aircraft units to homeland defense, troops that were desperately needed elsewhere. Most importantly, the attack pushed Japan's high command to accelerate their next major operation, Midway, the battle that would end in catastrophe. The plan for Midway was complex, involving multiple task forces advancing from different directions to trap the American fleet. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was chaos. Poor coordination and communication left the Japanese forces divided and vulnerable, while American codebreakers, having cracked Japanese naval ciphers, knew almost exactly where and when the attack would come. The officers at the August meeting didn't know how deeply their codes had been compromised, but they knew enough to be afraid. Fighting a war when the enemy can read your orders is a war already lost. In that quiet Tokyo conference room, one question lingered like smoke. Could Japan have won the war? It was a question no one dared to voice openly, yet every officer was thinking it. There were theories, endless what-ifs. What if Japan had never attacked Pearl Harbor? What if it had struck only in the South, seizing the oil fields but leaving America's pride untouched? Could the U.S. have been persuaded to accept a divided Pacific? But each alternative collapsed under the same truth. America's industrial power was too vast and Japan's resources too fragile. Even if Pearl Harbor had been avoided, even if every Japanese operation had gone perfectly, the empire still needed more oil, more steel, more rubber, more food. Without them, every victory would eventually fade into exhaustion. Japan had gone to war precisely because it needed those resources, and by doing so, had only guaranteed their loss. The resource crisis. By the summer of 1942, the numbers were already frightening. Japan's oil reserves, which had stood at roughly 50 million barrels in late 1941, were down to less than half. Fuel rations were tightening across the Navy. Aircraft training hours were cut. Transport convoys ran slower to conserve fuel. Even major fleet exercises were postponed. Every drop of oil burned in combat was a drop they could never replace. American submarines stalked the tankers carrying crude from the Dutch East Indies, sinking them one after another. By the end of the year, only a handful of Japan's original fleet oilers were still afloat. Worse still, the empire's refining capacity was limited. Even when oil reached Japan, it couldn't be processed fast enough into aviation fuel or diesel. The military called it the invisible front. There were no battles here, only numbers, shortages, and silent collapse. And this invisible front would eventually determine the fate of the entire Pacific War, the weight of industry. While Japan struggled to preserve what little it had, America was awakening like a giant. Factories that once built cars were now producing tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. Shipyards launched new destroyers and carriers faster than Japan could sink them. In 1942, Japan produced about 8,000 aircraft. America produced 47,000. By 1943, that number rose to 86,000, and by 1944, over 96,000 planes rolled off American assembly lines. The difference wasn't just industrial, it was cultural. The United States had become a nation of workers united by purpose. Every rivet hammered into an aircraft wing was part of a collective vow to avenge Pearl Harbor and to never again be caught unprepared. Japan's leaders had gambled that America lacked the will to fight. Instead, they had awakened its full fury, the code breaker's shadow. In another corner of the Pacific, unseen by most soldiers, a small group of American cryptanalysts had already changed the course of the war. Stationed at Pearl Harbor, Washington, and Australia, these mathematicians and linguists were quietly intercepting and decoding Japan's top-secret naval communications. The Japanese called their encryption system JN-25, believing it to be unbreakable. But by 1942, American intelligence officers, led by men like Joseph Rochefort, had cracked enough of it to anticipate major operations. This was how the U.S. Navy knew about Midway, how they positioned their carriers to ambush Japan's main force, and how, from that moment on, the Japanese Navy never truly fought blind again. Every secret operation, every convoy movement, every reinforcement plan, the Americans read them all. Japan, proud of its secrecy, was fighting a war whose outcome the enemy already knew: shattered morale. By late 1942, fatigue was setting in, not just on the front lines but within Japan's high command. The soldiers who had marched triumphantly through Singapore and the Philippines were now trapped in endless jungles, short on food, medicine, and ammunition. Letters from the front described starvation, malaria, and exhaustion. The officers in Tokyo read those letters in silence. The nation's newspapers still spoke of glorious victories, but everyone in that meeting knew the truth. The empire was slowly dying, and worse, the people could not be told. A fading empire. Every empire in history faces a moment when its reach exceeds its grasp. For Japan, that moment had already come. Its armies still occupied vast territories, its flag still flew over cities from Rangoon to Manila, but the lifeblood that sustained it, fuel, steel, and ships, was draining away. No amount of bravery could refill an oil tank. No samurai spirit could replace a lost carrier. The officers in that Tokyo meeting understood it, even if they couldn't admit it aloud. They were not fools. They knew the mathematics of war, and those numbers could not be reversed by courage alone. One by one, they bowed their heads. The meeting ended in silence. The empire had chosen its path, and now it would walk it to the end. 3 years later, Japan's cities burned under American firebombing. Its navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Its armies were scattered and starving across islands whose names few remembered. The empire that had once dreamed of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was now little more than ashes and memory. The men who had met in that Tokyo conference room in 1942 did not live to see its final collapse. Some died in battle, others in seclusion, and a few in quiet shame. But their decisions had shaped the fate of millions. The price of strategy history often remembers the drama of battle, the roar of aircraft, the flash of explosions, the triumph of victory. But the true story of war is often told in silence, in the meetings, the numbers, the choices made by men in rooms far from the front lines. At Pearl Harbor, Japan had struck with brilliance and precision, but without foresight. It had won the battle, and lost the war. For America, that day of tragedy became a source of unity. For Japan, it was the first step on a road that led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The paradox of Pearl Harbor is eternal. A perfect tactical victory that created a total strategic disaster. The rebirth of nations. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japan lay shattered. Its industries were gone, its cities leveled, its people hungry. Yet from those ruins, a new Japan emerged. One built not on conquest, but on creation. Factories that once made weapons began producing radios, cars, and cameras. The Navy's engineers became innovators of global technology, and in time, the same nation that had declared war on the United States became one of its closest allies. The lesson, learned through unimaginable cost, was simple. Power without wisdom destroys itself. Legacy of the meeting. That night in Tokyo in 1942, those weary admirals had looked into the abyss of their own creation. They saw the outcome written not in destiny, but in logistics, oil barrels, and production charts. It was not cowardice that silenced them, but the realization that their courage had been spent in service of a doomed vision. The empire had gambled against time, and time had won. History rarely offers simple villains or heroes, only choices and the consequences they bring. The story of Pearl Harbor is not only about fleets and fire, but about how a single decision, born of desperation and pride, can reshape the destiny of nations. As the last echoes of that meeting fade, we're left with a question that reaches far beyond 1942. How many wars are lost long before the first shot is fired? This was history of wars. Where every battle is more than a fight, it's a story of human ambition, belief, and consequence. If you found this journey through Japan's forgotten meeting meaningful, help this history live on. Like, share, and subscribe to join us for more untold stories from the past. Because every war makes history, but few remember how it truly began.